everybody and welcome back to another video by Funlearn Tutorials. In today's video, we'll be talking about consumer surplus, what it is essentially, theoretically and diagrammatically. Now before we start with the essential concept of consumer surplus, let me draw a simple demand-supply model. So let this be my horizontal axis where I mark my quantities, and let this be my vertical axis where I mark my prices. This is the standard representation of the demand-supply model. Now let me draw the standard demand-supply curves. So we have a downward sloping demand curve and we have an upward rising supply curve. Let me just mark them as well. So we have my price axis. This is my price axis, the vertical price axis. This is my horizontal quantity axis. These are the two axes. Then I have my upward rising supply curve and my downward sloping demand curve. Based on this representation of the demand supply, I can determine my equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. So essentially, if I think of the equilibrium price, that would be starting from this point, and if I think of my equilibrium quantity, it would be starting from this point itself. So this would be my equilibrium quantity. If I were to mark them, suppose this would be my equilibrium quantity P star and this would be my equilibrium quantity Q star. Let me think of the equilibrium point itself as point E. So this is my standard demand supply model. Now hypothetically speaking, if a consumer were to demand for amount Q1, since it's a small quantity, he would have been willing to pay a higher price P1, that is the law of demand. So if he were to demand quantity Q1, he would be willing to pay price P1 for that. If he were to demand for a higher quantity, say Q2, so suppose he were to demand quantity Q2, he would have been willing to pay price P2 for that. So this is price P2. Let me just write that a little clearly. So let me make P1 a little bit smaller so that I can fit in everything. This is price P1 and the one below is price P2. Again, if he were to demand some quantity Q3, he would have been willing to pay price P3 for that. That would have been P3. Note that as quantity increases, the price that he would be willing to pay decreases. That is the standard law of demand. But what happens is, essentially at the market equilibrium where demand meets supply, he actually demands quantity Q star and he ends up paying price P star. So this quantity Q star already includes Q1, Q2 and Q3. So for Q1 he should have been willing to pay price P1. For Q star he should have been willing, for Q2 he should have been willing to pay price P2. He ends up buying a lot more, but he does not have to pay so much. So if we think of it in this way, for quantity Q1, he was actually interested in paying OP1. So if I think of it as O, he was willing to pay price OP1. But since he's actually demanding a lot more, he does not need to pay this much price. He ends up paying only P star price. So for this Q1 amount of quantity, which is already included in Q star, because he is buying the first unit, say this is the second unit, this is the third unit, and he ends up buying 4 units. So for the first unit, suppose he was interested in paying 4 rupees for the, or 4 units of money, $4 or whatever. Suppose for the second unit of commodity, he was willing to pay 3 units of money. Suppose for the third unit of commodity, he was willing to pay price 2. And for the fourth unit, suppose he is willing to pay price 1. When he ends up buying 4 units, he does not have to pay all these higher prices. He just has to pay for 1 into 4 for the 4 commodities that he buys. But he does not have to pay rupees 4 for the first unit, rupees 3 for the second unit and rupees 2 for the third unit. What he ends up doing is, he ends up saving all this. This part he was willing to pay when he was demanding lower and lower commodities, lower and lower quantities of commodities. But at the market equilibrium, he does not have to pay for all these. Essentially, that is what a market does. A market essentially saves some consumer surplus. This part is essentially the portion of the consumer that he saves. He does not have to pay for these portion, though he was willing to pay for these portion. He was willing to pay 4 rupees for the first unit, but at the market equilibrium he ends up paying only 1 rupees for the first, 1 rupees for the second, 1 rupee for the third, as well as 1 rupee for the fourth, though he was actually willing to pay 4 rupees for the first, 3 rupees for the second, 2 rupees for the third, and 1 rupee only for the fourth. So he ends up saying 4 plus 3 plus 2 rupees. This portion is what is called the consumer surplus, and this consumer surplus is what is saved when the market operates in the perfect competition market, and this is the equilibrium market where demand meets supply. So this is the consumer surplus. Easier way, how do we know what is a consumer surplus? Consumer surplus is actually, if I think of it in mathematical terms, it would be the area under the demand curve. So let me just write it pictographically. Of course, if I have the equation, it would be easier to represent. But of course, if I think of it this way, suppose I write the equation D equal to A minus BQ. So if I write D equal to A minus BP, I'll have a demand function like this. So hypothetically speaking, if this represents the demand function, my consumer surplus would be the area under the demand curve. It would be the area under the demand curve minus OP star into OQ star, minus OP star into OQ star, or you can also write it as the rectangle OP star EQ star. So essentially it is the area under the curve up until 0 to Q star, capital Q star, that is the area under the curve till the equilibrium quantity minus the equilibrium price into equilibrium quantity, that is OP star EQ star. That would be the consumer surplus. That is, if I have non-linear demand curve, this formula would suffice. But if I were to think of it in the simplest way, where I have a linear demand curve, it would simply suffice to say that my consumer surplus is actually, if suppose this line, suppose I have the demand line meeting the price axis at some point, say X, then this consumer surplus would actually be X P star E. So it would be X P star E. That would be my consumer surplus. That is essentially the area of the rectangle X P star E. That would be my consumer surplus. Finally, the easiest way to find out consumer surplus is actually the area. Note that since it talks about consumer surplus, you have to think of it as the area under the demand curve. In our future video, we will be talking about something called a producer surplus, where we actually talk about the area under the supply curve. So this is why I am mentioning particularly that when I am dealing with consumer surplus, I talk about the area under the demand curve, because the demand curve represents the preferences and the decision makings of the consumer. So when I am thinking of consumers, I will be thinking about the demand curve, and this portion, this area is actually the consumer surplus.